My name is Mark Lee, Chairman of City Forum. I'm delighted to be able to introduce this podcast discussion between General Sir Jack Deverell, our senior military advisor who's helped City Forum for many years, and Lieutenant General Richard Wardlaw, Chief of Defence Logistics Support at the MOD. When we began this particular intelligent defence and smart power work, we were thinking about the effects of the fourth industrial revolution. COVID has become a big concern of the people who've been giving us thoughts as to what we should include. And this particular conversation between Jack and Richard today is really important in that context. Jack and I have been discussing just enough and just in time as ways of delivering what organisations need to be able to survive and prosper for a number of years. And the impact of COVID has been to make both of these principles somewhat questionable. And we thought a conversation on the merits of just in case would be really worth having. We have therefore made this a substantial part of the project for this year, and I greatly look forward to the conversation which is to take place.
Mark, thank you for those introductory remarks. To my mind, one of the more profound consequences of the coronavirus is the level of uncertainty and unease it has created about the future. There seems to be a growing sense that the world will not return to what it was before the virus struck, but then no great vision of what the alternative might, nor perhaps ought to be. I know that years spent fighting a world war is different from a few months fighting a pandemic, but the determination and optimism that led to the idea of creating a land fit for heroes in 1918 and the sweeping social reforms of the 1940s seems somehow lacking today. The future capabilities and structures of defence has been opaque for some time now, and I would guess that the effect of the virus has not made those answers any clearer. How relevant and sensible and sustainable might our current defence capabilities be if the world does not return to a recognisable form of business as usual? Will the current shift in power away from the USA and Europe continue, and will it accelerate? What deductions might our adversaries be drawing from both national and alliance responses to the pandemic? Meanwhile, the economic impact of the pandemic will reduce the money available for defence spending and probably discourage nations from increasing that spending. Another consequence, perhaps, has been an adverse impact on global and national supply chains. The principle of just in time, just enough has been at the heart of supply chain management and thus logistic support for a long time. Its importance in controlling costs by reducing levels of stockholding throughout the length of the supply chain is self-evident. However, if full value is to be realised, it requires high levels of confidence in the assured and timely passage of supplies throughout the length of the chain, and assured levels of data to track stock and predict future consumption. It is this level of assurance upon which, for example, the profitability of retail chains depend. But Clausewitz has things to say about friction in war, that it makes the simple very difficult. In addition, Field Marshal von Moltke predicted that no plan survives contact with the enemy, and it looks as if our pandemic planning suffered that fate. War is capricious, cruel and unfair. Outcomes are unpredictable. It is supremely wasteful in blood and treasure, and I would argue that it is hardly the environment for which just in time and just enough was designed. It may be that there are other areas of government and public service in which the same caveats apply. That's not to say that the principle is without merit within the military environment, but the interface between the just-in-time, just-enough requirements of the rear areas and the more pragmatic just-in-case attitude of the area of operations needs careful management. I fear that over the past 30-plus years, that line, if it can be described in that way, has crept further and further forward to the detriment of our fighting ability. I'd now like to bring in Lieutenant General Richard Wardlaw, and perhaps we might start, Richard, by discussing whether you believe defence has ever fully embraced just in time, just enough, Or is it that we have some sort of hybrid in place?
Well, thank you, Jack, and thank you for a very erudite introduction to the subject of supply chains and their importance. To answer your question up front, I would contend there is no straightforward answer to that, but I would say that the answer lies in part to what you said, which is about applying these ideas and theories intelligently, the intelligent application of just enough, just in time versus just in case. So the reality I would contend for the military supply chain is that by a degree of design, but arguably also a degree of accident, we have a hybrid approach whereby we are holding what would be viewed in the corporate sector as significantly excessive levels of supply of certain material and commodities. But in other areas, by a shortcoming in a number of our designs for the way we conduct our supply chains, either consciously or unconsciously not holding sufficient stock. The reality of the most recent crisis that we are all looking into now with COVID-19 is that it has highlighted a number of shortcomings in not only, if you like, the MOD, the military supply chain, but also supply chains more broadly within the public sector. And there are some very strong parallels, I would contend, between the two, and from which we need to all learn if we are to apply just enough, just in time, and just in case more intelligently going forward.
I do recall some years ago hearing a very senior civil servant saying that the business requirements of the rear were more dominant than the needs of the operational area, and his implication was that the practice in the operational area must be changed to reflect those business requirements, because that is the only place where savings can be made, to use that rather crude phrase. And I just wonder whether you had observed, and this was 25, 30 years ago, I just wonder whether you had observed any change in the way that we ask our operational forces to behave to meet the constraints and compulsions of the logistic system.
I mean, I think the point your colleague you referred to was making is a very fair one, and I would certainly agree that much of the last 20 years or so we have seen, for very understandable, very legitimate, both political and arguably senior military and senior civil service reasons, a sharp focus on efficiency. Efficiency underpins the targeting of waste and of inappropriate and unnecessary bureaucratic processes. But as with all efficiency drives, and I think this is playing to your point, one can go too far. And it is easy to go too far, especially when you do not have, in the immediate sense, the operational imperatives that going too far may undermine. But of course, over the last 20 years, British Defence has had more than its fair share of operational challenges. So notwithstanding what I think has been, from the business perspective, a very sharp focus on efficiency, we have had a steady drumbeat until quite recently of overseas and demanding operational requirements to be met, which universally, from a supply chain perspective, have been met. So that would question whether or not we have gone too far on the efficiency front. But I would suggest, as I look at the landscape today, post-COVID-19, we have concluded that in some areas we have probably pursued efficiency to a fault. But we have also done so, I think, without investing sufficiently in some of the facets that you described in your introduction. Not least, we have not invested sufficiently, if you like, in a clear supply strategy. We have not thought through and understood properly from the sort of line of sight from point of manufacture to consumption, exactly how those supply chains are behaving. I don't think we have sufficiently modelled the demands that we are likely to face in the worst case scenarios and map those against the capacity of the supply chain to meet those under those circumstances. And perhaps no surprise, because we have not done any of those, There is, to some degree, and we have witnessed in COVID-19, occasions where there has been a loss of confidence in the supply chain, and the result of that is perverse behaviours with people hoarding stock when it is unnecessary to do so, but it is entirely understandable when they lack the transparency associated with that supply chain to meet their needs. So all of these facets are at play, which sit behind, as you say, maybe 2 decades or more of a sharp focus on efficiency versus meeting, when the balloon goes up, the more extreme demands that we would face on any operation.
One of the things that interests me, of course, and you touched on it then, was this whole business of modelling possible scenarios or the impact of possible scenarios, because, of course, unlike some of the commercial chains who are recording data on a regular basis, a contemporary basis, what happened yesterday will influence and inform how many loaves of bread they put into their Basingstoke store next week or even tomorrow. We have not been involved in high-intensity operations since at least 2003 in Iraq, and I doubt if a commercial organisation would be confident of making plans based upon information which is 17-odd years old. So how does the military model effectively to give itself confidence and other people confidence that it can meet the requirements of something that is a core part of its rationale and requirement, but actually something that they seldom do?
Well, Jack, it's a very good question, and I think you put your finger on one of the, if you like, key differences between the supply challenge that we face in the military versus that which is the challenge in the sectors you've alluded to. So to answer the question, I suppose up front is my first point is that we do invest considerable effort in modelling the kind of demand that is likely to emanate from the scenario, the high intensity warfighting scenario that you described, and which we perhaps really only experienced most recently in 2003 in Iraq. But as with all modelling, they are predicated on a range of assumptions. Those assumptions include clearly the duration and distance at which we are fighting, the intensity that we can anticipate, and that is a function of who we might be fighting against and the nature of the fight that we might be involved in. And of course, all of those facets of the fight are changing. What was a typical high-intensity operation in 2003 was very different from the early 90s, and no doubt will be very different in the future. And so those modelling inputs are critical, lest you draw the wrong conclusions. They also address, I think, some wider factors which are critical to consider. Are we going to be fighting, for example, in an alliance? This has been certainly our experience for much of the last 40 to 50 years, that is the way we will fight. Well, if we're fighting alongside our usual allies, our NATO allies, then we need to understand that the total demand being experienced is not just down to what we are demanding, but the composite of all those forces in a given theatre of operations. And then you need to consider, if that is the total demand being faced in a given theatre, where are the pinch points in getting that material forward to those forces? Because we will no doubt be all using the same seaports, airports, and lines of communication. So these assumptions are absolutely critical. But I think there is something else I'd wish to touch on, which is that one can get the demand modelling either right or wrong. The reality is you will never be perfect, but you might be close enough. But in doing so, it is not sufficient just to invest in that understanding. What we must in defence do is learn actually from our colleagues in the civil sector and recognise, as we always have, if you like, that the freedom of action, the operational advantage that comes from having a robust and reliable supply chain isn't just about necessarily understanding the demand that you're going to face, but it is also about having in place the data flows to understand where you are holding stock, where it is from point of manufacture to point of consumption, what the likely routing of that supply will be, what the dependencies are on the various suppliers to meet the timelines that you have modelled and assumed can be delivered against, so that you together develop what I would characterise as modern resilience. It's not just about holding contingency, but it's about visibility of your supply chain intelligence, as I say, from point of manufacture all the way through to point of use, so that you have the break glass contingency where you need it and where you are carrying most risk against that model demand.
Martin Wolf, the economist, has suggested that the idea that you bring back to these shores your most vulnerable, indeed the majority of your capacity to feed your supply chain, to create a national supply chain rather than a global one, is itself full of potential consequences. And will not necessarily answer the question, but will merely change it into something else, and the vulnerabilities will be equally dangerous, but just different. Which leads me really on to the bit about national infrastructure. Is there a particular dependency on national infrastructure? I mean, ferries, for example, which go beyond the simple responsibility of defence.
So, Jack, I mean, to your first point, I think in this sort of post-COVID paradigm, there is a requirement, if you like, to revise and consider what we should offshore and that which maybe we need to bring onshore to underpin a greater degree of security in our supply chains. But I'm also of the view that we can never realistically have the perfect security of supply chain simply by onshoring, as we would think of it, the supply chain. The reality is that our reliance on materials from overseas is so profound now that this notion of a sort of sovereign freedom of action, sovereign security supply chain, I think is flawed. But there is more we can certainly do to bring more onshore, and I think we are giving active thought to that right now. And I think linked to that is this point about the resilience of the components that, if you like, service your supply chain, that enable your supply chain. And you're right to highlight that there are, in any supply chain, a number of areas where there are, if you like, nodal points or pinch points where capacity may become the limiting factor. And for the military, that has certainly been an area of our study for the last period and has been informed very much by the COVID experience and is part of something we're running inside the military called the Agile Stance Campaign Plan, where we are looking at testing and running high-level exercises, arguably for the first time in a very long time, exclusively focused on the capacity of the strategic base, as we call it, those aspects that enable us to outload a force at pace for a major operation. We are looking at every aspect of that strategic base to ensure that it is sufficiently invested in, that when the balloon goes up, it is able to deliver at the pace and volumes required.
One of the methods of actually reducing our holdings and therefore costs, of course, is the business of placing dormant contracts. And I wondered whether there was, and we've seen some of the vulnerabilities Public Health England suffered from contractual problems of getting PPE, and some of those were, I'm told, to do with dormant contracts. And I'm wondering, how dependent are we on dormant contracts, and what your view of the vulnerability of a dormant contract might be?
So they have a role to play, but they link back exactly to this point that you and I have discussed, I think, Jack, around supply chain intelligence. That intelligence function, if you like, is not only of our suppliers understanding their vulnerabilities, their capacity, their ability to meet the demands that we may place on them, alongside, of course, those other competitors for those same supplies. It's also about a supply chain intelligence function that looks at the wider market dynamics, what is occurring more broadly in the market in which we are competing for those commodity items. And of course, it should also be taking a forward look to view what are the geopolitical strategic shocks that are either out there that we can see coming, or at least understand what they might be to seriously confound the supply chain that we are now reliant on. So supply chain intelligence must underpin all of that understanding. And we also must recognise that we have to model against, if you like, what I would call market congestion. And we have seen this play out especially through COVID-19. To take a risk-informed view of what must we store more of in the event that there is the kind of congestion that we have seen with COVID-19, where all of a sudden the demand for PPE, focused on a very limited number of suppliers actually in the world, broke the bank. And we had, frankly, countries competing against each other for a limited supply. So it is about understanding demand, but it is fundamentally also about understanding your supply chain and its inherent vulnerabilities, and then taking risk-informed judgments as to where you need to keep your break glass contingency versus where you can afford to slim down perhaps your stock holdings to that which is sensible, given what you understand of the ability of the suppliers to meet that when the balloon goes up.
One of the criticisms of the way COVID-19 was handled by the government, by the country as a whole, is that the country is too centralised. Examples have been drawn from particularly Germany with a much less centralised way of governing. And I wondered whether you felt that there was a increased sense of centralisation within the governmental system, and whether those at the operational end were having enough influence on what was required and when it was required, or has that balance shifted dangerously towards more central control?
It's a very good question, Jack, and I think there are a number of dimensions to answering it. I think when you enter a very resource-constrained situation, as perhaps the NHS found itself at the front end of the crisis, there is, to some degree, a sense in centralising and having a top-down view of where demand lies versus the available supply, if that supply is, being overfaced. And we certainly, from the MOD perspective, we were leaning in to support the NHS in understanding that demand and supply dynamic. And you will recall how I think CDS in his number 10 briefing talked to the reality that we had to expand our understanding of the number of points of demand within the overall medical supply chain quite dramatically overnight, from a supply chain that had historically predicated supply on the hospitals to one that had to take into account over 50-odd thousand points of presence throughout the entire supply chain, and understand how that demand was aggregating up. But I think that was a crisis response to a situation where, if you like, the underpinnings to a modern resilient supply chain were not perhaps what they needed to be, not least the end-to-end information system that should underpin such a supply chain needs to be present, so that if you are, as you say, at the front end and demanding what you need to do whatever's required of you, that you have as much visibility of where your item has been, where your item is coming from and when it is likely to reach you. I think the analogy here with when you place an order with Amazon or one of the other online companies is relevant, that in part confidence at the front line of the customer experience is that visibility that they now enjoy of where the item sits in the supply chain and the anticipated time of delivery. So I would expect, as we move forward with defence, and we are now investing very heavily in our new business modernisation for support programme, creating the end-to-end logistic information services that the front line need as much as we do, if you like, at the business end, will absolutely empower the front end to understand how its demand sits in the overall context of the aggregate demand being placed on the system, and will in turn arm them with a clearer understanding of where that demand sits in priority and when they can expect to see the item reaching them. I think the answer is that we have seen facets of both at play, and in a crisis the reality is centralised demand and supply control was the reality we had to work through. But our goal should be to underpin the supply chain of the future with the kind of end-to-end information systems that allow all of us to have equal visibility.
I mean, you're talking about a form of a track and trace, I suppose, really.
That is certainly a component of it, Jack. It should be, depending on where you sit in that supply chain, your ability to interrogate how it is behaving clearly would differ. But visibility across your supply chain is an essential component of what we're building into the defence supply chain going forward.
My last question is whether you believe the decision points in the logistic chain match the decision points in the command chain. I know, in theory, the two should be the same, but what is your view on that?
Well, Jack, I mean, I firmly believe that this notion, if you like, of supply chain advantage or support advantage, as I call it in defence, is critical to the operational commander. It is a truism, but one that can be forgotten. You can have the most exquisite equipment that is capable of the most extraordinary effects, but in the final analysis will require its munitions replacing in a timely fashion. And the people operating that equipment will require their resupply if they are to continue operating in a sustained fight. So the reality is that support advantage, supply chain advantage remains for me a fundamental building block of what defence sees as operational advantage and must therefore be invested in. And that is exactly the journey that I am leading as Chief of Defence Logistics and Support.
Richard, thank you for that. I won't attempt to sum up because it's not my place to, and it's far too complex a discussion for any form of worthwhile summing up, except to say thank you very much for taking part. It is a very complex area. It is fundamental to the effectiveness of a force, as you rightly say, the most exquisite equipment, the best men and women, and the finest plan, completely undermined by an inferior logistics capacity. But thank you for sharing that with us and for spending time with us on such an interesting subject.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you for your time and interest.
I would like, on behalf of City Forum, as hosts of this podcast, and on behalf of BAE Systems, who sponsor the project, to thank you, Richard, for your realistic and honest assessment of where we are and where we need to be in relation to the supply chain and its contribution to operational advantage. I think in your discussion with Jack, you have made it absolutely plain that whatever the quality of our people, whatever the quality of our equipment, we shall be nowhere if our logistics capability is not of an appropriately high standard. You are leading an impressive effort to secure a greatly improved performance. I would like to express our thanks to you, Jack, for helping deliver such an interesting podcast, and hope this is an area to which we can return in future. You and I have discussed just in time, just enough and just in case on numbers of occasions in recent years, and this was an interesting leitmotif to the discussion you've had with Richard. City Forum will be continuing to look at aspects of reimagining British defence with a further webclave on the 15th of July, and we're also working on a programme entitled Global Britain, Polarisation, Grey Zone and Hybrid Conflict, which we've been asked to look at by senior figures from MOD. This will involve a number of events in the autumn period, and my office will be happy to provide some information, or you can find more on the City Forum website. Once again, thanks to BAE Systems for support, and thank you, Richard and Jack, for doing such excellent work to make this podcast successful. Thank you.